you who are in the room, but also welcome to those who are watching online. This is being live streamed. So just to also make you aware when you come to the question and answer time, don't let it intimidate you, but you are being live streamed as well. It's my great privilege to welcome today to Dr. Rajesh Tandon to speak with us around the theme which is close to his heart on engaged scholarship and knowledge democracy, reinventing community-based participatory research. Rajesh, we've had a series of talks this fall around the theme of engaged scholarship and what it means for development studies. There's really nobody that I can think of better than Rajesh to conclude this series, looking at drawing from his really rich history of community-based participatory research. We were just reminiscing. I first met Rajesh in 1980 in what we think was one of the world's first academic gatherings on participatory research. Rajesh then went on to start the PRIA, which is the Society for Participatory Research in Asia, which has now just celebrated your, can't do my math, 34th year, as a key NGO working in India and across Asia and actually across the world, mobilizing knowledge for participation, for democracy, for advocacy, for other forms of development. Throughout that time, Rajesh has not only been director of PRIA, but has been a world leader in the participatory research and more recently the community-based research movement. In 2012, he was chosen by UNESCO to become the co-chair on community-based research and social responsibility in higher education with Professor Bud Hall. And Bud and Rajesh have used that position as UNESCO co-chairs to really continue to build the global conversation about how universities and communities work together in a more democratic form of production of knowledge. Rajesh has written extensively around participation, democracy, governance, and also participatory research. And I think he'll be speaking a little bit today about a book that's just come out, published through the UNESCO chair, on strengthening community-university partnerships, global perspectives. Rajesh, you may also be mentioning the work that he's pioneered in India, which has actually brought significant policy change in India on how the government actually recognizes and supports the importance of universities engaging with communities. So the work is engaged scholarship. It's affected policy around the world. It's affected the work of thousands of practitioners over the last 40 years. We actually have one of my favorite videos that I made with Rajesh on what is participatory research. It was a question I asked him in 1982, I think, 83, when I had the privilege of being with Rajesh in India. Rajesh has also been a civil society leader around the world. He's chaired many global civil society networks. He serves currently as the chairperson of the Global Alliance on Community Engaged Research and a number of other global international leadership positions. So Rajesh, thanks so much for taking this time to share some reflections, I think, of your 40 years of work on building community-based participatory research and how the democratization of knowledge contributes to democracy building. Welcome.
Thank you, John. Thank you all. I guess for the purpose of proper streaming, I'll stand there and make a presentation, and then when we have question and answers, I'll join you here. John and I have known each other for many years, and therefore he asked me how he should introduce. I said, I won't tell you what you should say, but I might tell you what you should not say. Because when you know somebody for 40 years, you know a lot more that needs to be shared in public. Let me just give you, in Bollywood, which is the sort of the film industry of the country I come from in India, which has now taken over Hollywood, I'm proud to say. In Bollywood there is a way of filming which is called flashback. And you so typically it happens is that you are sort of standing here in ideas, convening space, looking at all of you, and then you flash back 40 years. And so John's introduction did that effect of flashback. I have a academic preparation in post-secondary level, which comprised of such fancy disciplines as electronics, engineering and management. And my first job was a lecturer in management in Institute of Management, Calcutta in India. Because it appeared to me that teaching was a noble profession, and a large number of people on my mother's side, 3-4 generations, were teachers of various stages of schooling, from pre-primary to university. I decided to do my PhD because it made sense if I was going to do teaching, I'd do PhD. And so I went to US and School of Management, but focusing more on organizational and social change issues. And while I was there, political emergency was declared in India, and the constitution was suspended. So I found a way, which perhaps American way is creative, is in the guise of field work I returned home, because there was no other legitimate basis to go back to India. My professors asked me what was the topic of my field work, and to my great surprise, I think I must have dreamt something, and I said I want to study how rural development programs reach or don't reach poor peasants in India, something like that. And in order to convince, many of you may be doctoral students, so you know this fine art, you have to prepare some sort of a 2-page note and provide half a dozen references. In the library of School of Management in Case Western Reserve University, there was only Economic and Political Weekly, which used to come, there was no other literature. So anyway, I managed to get to India and parked myself in a new institution called National Labour Institute. Now, as political leaders go, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was very astute and clever. So while on the one hand, constitution was suspended and emergency was declared, she also used that time to make some very progressive legislations through ordinance, including abolition of bonded labor, abolition of rural indebtedness, etc. So National Labour Institute was set up to propagate the progressive policies during emergency. What better contradiction? And I am repeating that story to you because that's how life moves. You find spaces in contradictions. So I ended up in southern Rajasthan with the blessing of a very senior person who had worked in the government but had set up a literacy program, an institution called Seva Mandir. And they were doing farmers' functional literacy. And basically my interest was to collect some data about whether functional literacy programs, agricultural development programs were benefiting the farmers or not. But I ended up finding another contradiction, and that contradiction had to do with the way I was doing research. Now, given my background, I was statistically well prepared. I was using computers in 1967, so I was statistically well prepared. And I used those preparations to begin to get some information But because I was hanging around there, I was also doing something which would border on activism. I was getting them organized, I was training them in how to deal with government officials and sort of build a network across villages to put pressure from below. I was doing all those other things. And every now and then I'll be reminded that I'm a doctoral student, so I have to collect data. So then I will revert to my statistically robust technology. And this, after 4 or 5 months, 6 months, this was troubling because it didn't sit together very well. And one day an old farmer sort of got hold of me, and he asked me what was I doing with these pieces of paper and pencil which I would go around collecting data on. So I said, I told you I'm doing PhD, I need to collect data. He said, yeah, I remember. So, but he said, well, why do you need all this? Pieces of paper and this. I had a psycho-style questionnaire. We started by asking, what's your name? What's your age? What's your income? By the time you reached age, you had to have a negotiation because a 50-year-old man will say, I'm 22, come on, man, But there is no evidence. So you have to take it as it is. So then he sort of basically said, can I see? I said, yes. Can I hear? I said, yes. Can you smell? So then why do you need all this? You are the research instrument, basically. Go, reflect on what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you are smelling. Trust yourself more than this piece of paper, basically. So I ended up with half-baked, poor quality data, but a lot of questions on methodology. And returned to complete my thesis because the very idea of, and my chair of my thesis committee said, this is all rubbish, now you will do field work in downtown Cleveland. Change the topic of your thesis. Tears in my eyes. Mercifully, I found a colleague there, a professor who supported me, Professor Dave Brown, and became a friend since then. And I found a reference which Dr. Bud Hall in nearby Toronto was writing about. He had written something in 1975-76 on participatory research. Now, as you know, you can come up with any original idea you like, but unless you quote some references, it doesn't carry weight. Right? So, I needed references. So you invent, find, collate, systematize references. Then that whole experience gave birth to my not returning to Institute of Management to teach, but to look at people's knowledge and the contestation people's knowledge had vis-a-vis the more dominant forms of knowledge which were typically in the written form. And in the kind of work that whether it is agriculture or whether it is water harvesting or whether it is primary healthcare, the people's knowledge, the sort of practitioner knowledge, the knowledge gained through struggles in life and experimentation in life, generally remained in the oral tradition. It was knowledge in use as opposed to knowledge in book. And therefore that knowledge was generally dismissed to the extent that the people who had that knowledge themselves felt they were ignorant or stupid. And those of us who carried some heavy-duty degrees from outside would walk in and pretend we are the experts. So essentially the work that I began to do, whether it was around question of forestry or water or land alienation or occupational health and safety, is to look at the knowledge and help systematize the knowledge of communities and sort of build a conversation between their knowledge and the sort of the privileged dominant knowledge system, and challenge that through that. And through this process, if women can feel that they have a body of knowledge that can be respected, then they feel empowered. And so that is how PRIA's work developed over the years, and I'm giving you by way of flashback. In the first 10-12 years of our work, till about mid-90s, 15 years of our work, we were generally, in our context, rejected by the academia, because they said this is all voodoo science, this is all activism and all that, there's no new knowledge in this, you guys don't do knowledge, we do knowledge. Now, so I basically withdrew from academic engagement for 15 years. And we contributed to the ever-growing divide between the world of research and the world of practice, the academe and the community. In mid-90s, through disciplines like sociology, social work, nutrition, public administration, and regional planning. So these kinds of disciplines, some of the academic institutions began to interact with PRIA and began to sort of look at this as a potentially useful methodology, not necessarily research methodology, but methodology that their students should somehow acquire. In the course of that conversation, I think a larger acceptance of the world of practice and the world of research began to happen. Now, in the meanwhile, of course, when I was beginning to do this, my dear friend John Gaventa and his very dear partner Dr. Juliet Merrifield were in a place called the Highlander Research and Action Center in Tennessee. And they were heavy-duty activists using knowledge. Since then, of course, Professor Gaventa joined academic institutions in US and Canada and in IDS. And my other reference provider, Dr. Budhall, went and joined University of Victoria in Canada. And in the context in which I live and work, I was overage to join an academic institution, so I didn't get it. But by 2006 or 7, it appeared that there was beginning to be a new conversation in higher education circles. And the reason it was happening, as far as I could determine, is that the global development enterprise had more or less done primary education, literacy and secondary education, and was now sort of beginning to say, well, what about tertiary? Because there are countries and regions where tertiary education is shambles. So, you could have a World Bank meeting around financing higher education or things like that around that time. There was a fellow IDS person called Dr. Peter Taylor, who was invited by a network called GUNI, Global University Network for Innovations, which was born out of the first higher education conference of UNESCO. You will be surprised to know, if you don't know this, that UNESCO only in 1998 realized to convene the first higher education. UNESCO had convened conference on literacy, on primary education, on women's education, on culture, this, that, on everything by that time. But higher education only in 1998. And out of that conference came this network, GUNI network, which is essentially a university network. But its purpose is to raise questions about innovation or new challenges facing higher education. And Guni, because by 1999, 2000, the European Union's contribution to Spain had created surplus in their budget. Spain was pumping funding globally on development. Now, of course, they are broke. But so in Barcelona, the secretariat is located. Spanish university system is a separate issue, but secretariat is in Barcelona. And Peter was invited to be a guest editor of their third book on role of higher education in human and social development. And if those of you who are interested in higher education should read Guni books, because they are globally produced, they are well researched, they are good collection of. There was one on quality, there was one on financing, one on this, one on sustainability. So Guni Peter got hold of me to write something on who sets the agenda for human and social development. And I sort of looked back from 1950s onwards, and every single issue which was of significance, I found the agenda was set outside the academia. It was set in the world of practice, whether it was child rights, or whether it was gender issues, or whether it was ecological challenges. So when I wrote that and presented it, many of the university-based scholars felt that this was an affront to their creativity and forward-looking thinking. But out of that, a conversation again began, which said that why is it that when the world of practice throws up some questions which are of enormously intellectual interest, why don't they get picked up? What's coming in the way? Why are these questions not being studied in a way? And why are they not studied in a manner of partnership? So, in 2009, UNESCO held the second higher education conference. There have been only two so far. But in 2009, 2008 had happened, and 9/11 had happened, other things had happened in the world. So by 2009, the pressing societal agenda, whether it was exclusion, inequality, financial markets not working, or security or whatever, was on top of it. And that conversation in the second UNESCO Higher Education Conference was around, does higher education have any role in addressing, in supporting those who address these questions? Or is it going to have a world of its own, independent? And by 2009, if you remember, there was, I must run my PPT. My colleagues will ask, did you show it? But by 2009, knowledge economy was the dominant discourse, if you remember. In about 70 countries of the world, largely through World Bank and those kinds of stimulation, knowledge commissions were set up in 70 countries. And every country was being encouraged to look at knowledge economy. And of course, WTO had already provided the framework of intellectual property right. So knowledge economy, knowledge could be traded, etc., etc. And in any case, some parts of the world were tired of physical economy. They didn't want to produce, do agriculture or produce, tires or things like that. They wanted to produce ideas and WhatsApp, etc., etc. So knowledge economy sort of was being driven. Now, therefore, if I now come to today's context, in this sort of a quick span of history of what happened to the work I was doing in engaging with higher education system and what was happening in places like UNESCO's arenas. So the first sort of, very quickly, what is happening is that now we have multiple and competing sites of knowledge production. 30, 40 years ago you could say, where is knowledge produced? Well, it's produced in university, higher education institutions, or some specialized research labs or things like that. But this is no longer the case. You have not only academic institutions producing knowledge, but also civil societies producing knowledge. You have UN system producing knowledge. World Bank is producing knowledge. The Human Development Report is a very stable sort of reference, but it is produced in a different way. Its research question is framed in a very different way. So, business is producing knowledge, media is producing knowledge, all kinds of. So this is one reality we are in. Second is, because of the drive for knowledge economy, you have a sort of proliferation of expertise. And it's almost like a knowledge industry, where you have almost like a manufacturing shop floor, assembly line, knowledge assembly line. Some people who design startups, then some people will brand it, and some will prepare the back end, and some will do front end, and all kinds of fellows. Consulting firms, big business in knowledge economy. In fact, I think in a few years, all the RFPs in the world will be taken over by PricewaterhouseCoopers or KPMG, and nobody else will win an RFP because they are the competent souls. So, it's a different era, and therefore, the third is that financing of knowledge production and dissemination has become multipolar. You take an issue like malaria, study on malaria. Now, 30 years ago it was WHO and national health systems which were studying malaria. Now Gates is studying malaria. Some of the pharmaceutical companies are financing research in malaria. Not necessarily all have shared objective. They have different parts of the objective. But so now there are competing multipolar financing, on most of the concerns that we have. You have seen what is going on in Paris for the last 2 days, that a large body of knowledge which tends to show that nothing has changed in the world has been financed properly. And many academics have contributed to that body of knowledge, saying global warming is nonsense, it is in your imagination, it doesn't exist in reality. So these kinds of competing approaches, financing mechanisms have come into play. And I think that contestation around dominance of knowledge has become a big one. I was attending a meeting this morning as part of the Rising Power Study Center here at IDS with DFID people in the morning, and one question they kept on asking is, what's China going to do? How do we know what China is going to do? Even Chinese don't know what China is going to do. But the question emanates from the hegemonic, counter-hegemonic pressures that are being faced around who will define what is development, what is development priority, what is development programming, etc. So that has changed in some way. So now better tell you about the study, otherwise Bud Hall will be, I'm sure he's looking at this streaming. Hi Bud. So what happened? John mentioned to you how we became UNESCO chair. I want to give you a little more story on how we became UNESCO chair. So we were there in the second UNESCO Higher Education Conference in 2009, July in Paris. And we were sort of doing our own thing. We were talking about partnerships between university community. And it was very interesting that within the UNESCO system, there were questions being asked about social responsibility of higher education, social responsibility of universities, social responsibility of higher education. And the question was coming from the massification of higher education that was beginning to take place in some parts of the world, particularly Asia. And if you look at higher education systems in China, in India, and a lot of Asian countries, a large number of new students in colleges and universities are first generation. Their parents never went to colleges and universities. The enrollment rates have increased. Now, when tribal or indigenous students come to higher education, or when Dalit or scheduled caste students come to higher education and they see a curriculum, they don't connect with that curriculum. It's even within our context, it is a middle class, upwardly mobile, slightly westernized, English medium kind of, even if it is taught in local language, the curriculum is more or less the same. In fact, if you look at political science, sociology, or any of these disciplines, the curriculum in Canada and in UK and Indonesia and India and Uganda may look very similar. So those students began to raise this question. Then, of course, the private financing of higher education began to happen in many parts of the world. And while people were talking about internationalizing higher education, many countries, including UK, were busy recruiting foreign students in the name of internationalization. So all these things were happening, and policymakers and some commentators were beginning to say, why should public funding be spent on this? What's the social relevance of higher education? If it is only going to produce and reproduce elites, business elites, political elites, let them self-finance it. What's the big deal? What's the country getting? This whole public good versus private good debate had happened. And so a lot of that discussion in 2009 UNESCO conference was around social responsibility in higher education. And Bud and I and people in Guni, we were talking about looking at multiple ways of constructing knowledge and therefore partnerships in community-based participatory research as a way of enriching knowledge, as a way of making knowledge located in social and political and economic questions of our times. In a way addressing pressing human challenges of our times as a way of research and knowledge production function. So in 2010, therefore, UNESCO's Higher Education Division approached us to say, would we formulate something on UNESCO chair? Little did we realize that this designation comes without any chair, by the way. You have to use your own old chairs. And we proposed, and hats off to UNESCO for agreeing to that it will be a co-chair arrangement. So a Western Canada academic institution, a university-based professor as co-chair, and an India practitioner, PRIA, civil society organization as a co-chair. UNESCO did not have a system to accommodate such mechanism, but they agreed. So in their standard language, they would say teaching of students and doctoral candidates, etc., will be the function of, one of the functions of co-chair. So we added training of community scholars and practitioner researchers and all that language. And lo and behold, they accepted it. So from 2012 September, now it's about 3 years plus, Bud Hall and I are UNESCO co-chairs. Once we got this, then we said, what is it that we are going to do to be relevant ourselves? Now, because of this conversation that was beginning to take place among higher education people, and those who were David Watson, people here in UK, and Philip Albach, and people who were theorizing about higher education had begun to raise that debate. In 2010, Government of India set up a subcommittee in preparation of its 12th five-year plan. and within the higher education stream called Social Engagement of Higher Education. And I was brought and made a member of the committee, and I started working with a group of vice chancellors and other educationists to figure out what is this all about. But again, it is the public financing question, it is the social pressure function that was beginning to raise this. So as John mentioned, we had by 2012, in the 12th five-year plan, a section on social responsibility of higher education. And that section is now being operationalized. The University Grants Commission has created a scheme. As you know, if you don't have a scheme, nothing happens. You can have a policy, but you need a scheme. The scheme means money, real world. So one of the things we started to do was to look at what is going on in this world. Let's do a global survey of what kind of relationship around knowledge production is happening between universities and communities. And this study is the one which we did over the last 3 years. We first did a global survey, and then we did selected from that survey on the basis of knowledge we had 12 countries where we did in-depth case studies of how this was happening. And this is a book that has come out of it. It's an e-book, open access, and this is a manual. We realized that registrars and rectors don't read books, they read manuals, even if they are professors. By the time you become a registrar, you have no appetite for books, you need manuals. So what are the key findings? And I want to then come to my last slide, which is the one I want to engage you on with. But let me give you quickly. It's not surprising that research partnerships differ. Nobody said we don't partner, because it was, I think, not politically acceptable to say we don't partner. But what it meant was very different. And a phrase which had emerged while we were doing the study, and we used it in the study to ask, was co-production of knowledge. And we were finding this phrase being used by some funding research councils and some other people. So we said, well, what is this? Do you do co-production of knowledge? Yes, we do co-production. Second question, who frames the research question? Of course we do. What happened to the community in framing research question? No. Once we frame the question, then we go to it. So we began to tease some of this verbosity versus reality kind of thing. So the language was co-production, but the practice differed greatly. And the most interesting thing we found was there were only a few countries where higher education policy was framed in the context of national development. Indonesia, India, Brazil. So when you read their higher education policy, and South Africa, if you read their higher education policy, government policy, you will see references must contribute to national development, this, that, some language to do that. Most other places, it didn't refer to anything like that. Then the second thing we discovered was that in some research funding situation, there was a specific stream of funding for partnerships. Canada, Indonesia, South Africa, and the new scheme that Government of India has produced. European Union. We found European Union for the last 10 years has been encouraging universities under various labels to make research responsive. And now in their Horizon 2020, they are making it even more explicit. So if so the finding is like this: if national policy gives anchoring of higher education in some context of national development, and if it provides for some funding which supports engagement or engaged research, etc., then it happens more. Otherwise, it is left to individual institutions, vice chancellors, leadership of the institution. It does not work like that. And the most we had in these 12 countries, we selected a couple of universities and we looked at their partnerships with civil society in depth. In research partnerships, when we look at those cases, and you will find some detail in the book, and we asked the university people, so what impact your research had? They will list a series of impacts on the community. And you ask them, did it have any impact on you or your institution? No, we never thought of that. That's not the purpose of research, is it? So partnership did not have an impact on one partner, or the impact was not studied or documented or recognized. You ask the civil society, say in the same partnership, and they would say, yeah, we found the research useful and this and that. But those guys were very rigid. They didn't have time, they didn't have interest, they didn't have patience, they didn't want to listen, all these kinds of. So, what we are beginning to sort of recognize, and these are the questions that, so I'm presenting to you because these are questions I am confronting myself, is that community university research partnership or research alliance or this community-based research methodology and perspective needs to be framed in a rigorous and accountable engagement sense. So both concepts are relevant. Rigor is relevant just as accountability is relevant. Now, if you look at, there was a time when 10-15 years ago when you did research and dissemination was never seen as a responsibility. You did research, you published or presented in a conference, and that's about it. If 10 people read it, that's it. Because only my knowledge is so specialized that only 10 matter. Fair enough. Slowly, people began to, mostly funders and policymakers, say, well, dissemination should happen. So, the phrase dissemination came. But dissemination was passive. Even when the disclosure policy of the World Bank was established, in the first 10 years, they did passive dissemination, which meant they put on their website information about the project which is going to happen among tribals in Odisha, where nobody knew English and nobody knew what is the website. So it was a sort of passive dissemination, say, I've done my job. Then of course, 5-7 years ago, a new phrase came, knowledge mobilization. So there was a slightly more active mobilization. Now, knowledge mobilization, and it was couched in sort of phrases like results framework, value for money kind of framework. Are you giving me something worth the money I put in your research? Those kinds of. It has never been couched in the framework of accountability. Now, if you look at the history of participatory research that I began to describe briefly to you, a significant part of that methodology is to be accountable to those communities and social systems from where you do research. Taking findings back to them in a way that they can chew it and confront you with counter findings and analysis was seen as a basic principle of doing participatory research because it was framed in an accountability perspective, not in a knowledge mobilization or value for money or sort of results framework kind of perspective. Now, so engaged scholarship requires a type of rigor which is increasingly not supported through financing tools or mechanisms, or even the incentive structures inside academic institutions. You are promoted on the basis of how many refereed articles you have published in refereed journals or whatever. There is very little in very few countries we have come across, or very few institutions where your work is valued and incentivized when it's based on engagement. So there is a individuals may do it because they believe in it, but institutionally this is not still valued and recognized. And increasingly in the context of global ranking of universities, and everybody wants to be a Harvard and Oxford, and none of them will make it, by the way. But they want to run the race, so run. There is now counter pressure on saying, is your research globally competitive or whatever? Can you get an RFP funded from World Bank or ESRC or whatever? The co-construction, we are raising this question that co-construction is about co-governance of research, starting from framing of research, asking the research question. It cannot be, co-construction is not merely about talking to people, getting their point of view and saying, well look, you can be co-author. But this is a very purpose of co-governance of research is to also ask question the purpose of research. How will it be used, what findings will be used, in what manner, by whom, to what end, etc., etc. So that is a second sort of challenge we are finding. A third challenge that we are finding is that research partnerships is not taught in any research methodology course. You are taught how to design research, but you're not taught partnership in designing research. And in fact, there is value being given historically to solo researchers. Academic brilliance is an individual trait. You invent knowledge by lying on the floor and an apple falls on your head and say, here they come. Well, apple doesn't fall on 10 heads at the same time, because you were not playing soccer together or whatever. So, point is that there is actually a reverse premium, which is on individual brilliance, individual creativity, call it whatever. And working together, forget the community, even working together inside academia is a challenge. So capacities to build and nurture partnerships, which are not very complicated capacities. You have to start by valuing others' point of view, listening instead of speaking, unlearning your frameworks, your theories, your pet tools, unlearning all of that. Listening to a music and saying, that's a body of knowledge. Or only looking at this as a body of knowledge. So, we are beginning to see this, that even where there is interest and enthusiasm, even among students we find all the time, because they are concerned about social relevance of whatever knowledge they are producing, that we need to have some capacity in doing partnership-based research, community-based research. So, in many research councils now we are beginning to see this idea that they should fund this. And I think in a couple of research councils we have succeeded. The University Grants Commission in its new scheme has included learning about community-based participatory research, for which you can use the funds, and I think the Canadians have done that as well. So, finally, the point about knowledge democracy is essentially a valuing multiple perspectives of knowledge, modes of knowledge production, etc. And there are a few trends we can see: open access, social responsibility. These are the kinds of the European Union sort of talking about responsive research. Those kinds of ideas which are beginning to get some traction in mainstream higher education institutions, I think will contribute to this broader discourse of knowledge democracy. We believe that political democracy is unsustainable with knowledge monopoly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rajesh, and thanks for some of your flashbacks as well as some of your modern PowerPoints. Let's just take a couple of minutes. Turn to your neighbor and buzz. Just reflect. What's something interesting, something aha moment, or something you really resonated with what Rajesh said? And then we'll ask you questions or make comments as well. Let's come back together, and I'm sure Rajesh would love both questions or comments from your perspective. We'll take 2 or 3 at a time, and then we can allow Rajesh to respond. We'll start with John.
Hi Rajesh, thank you very much for a really stimulating and entertaining talk. I enjoyed it tremendously. I actually came in here, my head was full of other stuff that I've been doing today, so this has been really good fun. Thank you. I hope you'll forgive me, this is a slightly convoluted sort of discussion point with a question. But, I wonder if you could say something a little bit about the different sort of ethical perspectives or systems that are coming together in participatory, in partnership research, because it's something which I've turned over many times. For example, when supervising a PhD student from India who comes from a very much a sort of community development background, someone I admire tremendously who is passionately committed to supporting poor and marginalized rural women from tribal communities in India. And for various reasons, she embarked on a PhD with me. I should probably mention that nobody in the room knows this person. It's from my previous university. And one of the interesting and most challenging things about working with her has been a sort of clash of our ethical systems, so to speak, in that she chose to embark on a PhD program, and the PhD program has certain sort of hoops that you have to jump through, and it has its whole system, which is an ethical system. It's an ethics of knowledge, and it's something which I do believe in and endorse, in the sense that if I'm in a forum like this one, or like a United Nations meeting, or a meeting with a government minister, the only thing that gives me any right to express myself, to have voice, or to have any authority to talk about a topic, it's not because of the colour of my skin or my gender, or because I come from former imperial power. It's because I've been through a set of procedures of research to learn something, and so I can bring that knowledge and speak on behalf of that knowledge to somebody who holds power and maybe can do something with it. I think that the student that I'm thinking of was sometimes impatient with all of the stuff that we were asking her to do, going through this whole process, because she urgently wanted to go back to the community and share it with the community, and so this was a sort of clash of ethical systems. That's what I want to drive at, and I wonder whether you could say something about how we negotiate that in a way which is respectful of the fact that ethical systems are they're meaningful and they're important to both sides concerned. It's not that one set of ethics is correct and the other is wrong. They both deserve respect, and it's something which I struggle with in my work. So I'd be interested to know what you think.
Great, thanks, Don. That's a big one. Do you want to think about that for a minute and see if there's other comments or questions? Please. Maybe you can introduce yourselves when you...
Thank you. My name is Melanie. I'm Egyptian. I'm doing Masters of Participation. Well, I was quite surprised in a good way that you spoke a lot about higher education. As for the past 3 years, I've been coordinating an Arab alliance for universities' civic engagement. And it was not easy at all, because basically of the last sentence that you mentioned, that political democracy cannot be sustained with the monopoly of knowledge. So we had a lot of challenges on so many levels. So we have on the political level, because civic engagement can be dangerous when you have a lot of this coming out of Arab Spring and coming out of pollution and stuff like that. You really don't want to empower them more. On another level, you have professors with kind of old-style way of teaching, or different view of things. On the other hand, you have students who are depressed themselves, coming out from really intense political situations and losing any hope of change. Well, this all would be one thing comparing to the system that actually does not encourage any kind of involvement or engagement in the society. So we had kind of challenging task in this alliance, and we ended up having meetings with higher authorities and ministries of higher education, and basically we had an impact on ground because we needed to change a lot before we can do anything. So, do you have certain advice for such a project in such an intense context and quite challenging now? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, Rajesh, those are two big ones. How do we handle the clash of ethics and negotiation across ethical systems, and how do you build knowledge democracy in a context that has little political democracy? Is that a way of rephrasing your question? Yes.
Yeah, as you said, big ones. First of all, I think what I was referring to as rigor is what you are adding another lens on it, another layer on it, is the ethics part, so the requirement, the steps towards achieving that. And rigor is really important. Rigor is important, and I think people tend to confuse rigor with numbers, or chi-square test is rigor. All this is, it's not. Rigor would entail asking a series of questions which open sort of the layers of the onion, so to speak, and not stop at the first superficial answer. And in doing that, constantly challenging your own framework through which, or lens through which you look at that. So some people peel onions with hand and some peel with knives. So if you are peeling with hand, keep in mind that some others will peel with knife. So that way you are making your analytical work more rigorous. And in the process, by experiences, you end up always refining your frameworks, irrespective of how well developed they were to begin with. So, the part about practitioners trying to get into higher education system and do masters and PhD, etc., has another layer of challenge, and that has to do with using experience as a metaphor for voice, kind of thing. So I am experiencing exploitation, so I speak about it. But when you want to present it as a rigorous analytical material, you have to then go beyond your immediate experience. You have to look at the underlying dynamic by which that experience is generated and how widespread that experience is, how common that experience is, how ghettoized that experience is, etc. So, many a times when people who have been in social change business for long, then they come to reflect on it, and reflection can lead to PhD or not. It's not very easy. For one thing, it is not easy is that it is, in order to reflect on it, you have to critique your experience. In order to critique your experience, you have to sort of take it out of your soul and put it on the table and allow somebody else to critique it too. But because you have been championing a cause all your life, while championing a cause, you don't want any critiques, because otherwise it will lose. You will lose your passion, you will lose your energy. So you want believers at that time. So it's, pursuit of social change is like following a sect. You're a set of believers, you're believing in a sect, in a path. And stepping behind, we have tried so many times in PRIA to bring practitioners to do reflection and write up their reflection. Writing is impossible anyway, because you work in oral tradition, you forget about writing. So reflection is not easy. And what is perhaps, I don't know whether it possibility exists, but when a group of them come together, 5, 6, 7 of them, then reflection becomes easier. But then I don't know whether a group can get a PhD or not. But your point is very well taken. By the way, in our current formulation, PRIA's first 30 years was knowledge is power. And now, last couple of years, we are saying knowledge, voice, democracy. So, knowledge, democracy has voice in between. But voice without knowledge, in our view, is not adequate. And you can have a voice based on somebody else's knowledge, but unless you begin to own that knowledge somehow, your voice will not carry the weight that it requires. So I sort of understand what you're saying, because we have had great difficulty in getting practitioners go through a rigorous academic, analytical kind of a program where they write up their reflections and they do try to sort of say this is irrelevant. Why should we go through these steps? Or even something like the way I use literature review. I say, okay, this is your research question. Great, valid. What do we already know about it? No. What do we know? Because when you unpack it, you may find that maybe 80% of that information or knowledge already been accumulated. That's what literature review is. You can do people review, you call it knowledge review, but that's what it is. You take stock of what we already know on that question, in that context. And then you say, okay, that leaves this set of sub-questions unanswered, so we're going to focus our research work on that. Your experience is not unique. When I was in that committee, I mentioned to you, and all the vice chancellors and serious educationists were sitting there. They said, no, we are already doing engagement. In India, we have a scheme called National Services Scheme, NSS. All students in colleges and universities have to compulsorily put in a few hours in a year to this NSS. Now what is NSS? NSS has nothing to do with your teaching or your research. It is in the evening, free time, weekend, you go plant some trees, you go clean some slum, you tell some poor people, okay, cut your nails and brush your teeth. This is what NSS is all about. So I said, well, this is all fine and good, keep doing it, but how does engagement happen in your core function of teaching and research? How do you engage in research and how do you engage in teaching? In your curriculum, in your pedagogy, and in the way you frame research, and conduct research, and use research findings. So, my experience is that we must bet on students. Students want to do it. I have not come across students who don't want to engage. They're tired of sitting in the classroom. They find it irrelevant. Even if they're studying mathematics, they would rather go out and do it. So, bet on students. Whatever happened to students doing campus rebellion? And a lot of that campus rebellion was not about Vietnam War only. It was about the way curriculum was designed and taught. And we have come across a question which I think I am now beginning to, as John was introducing you, a bulk of my identity is civil society. I convene, first of all my civil society friends around the world have been shocked that I have become UNESCO co-chair. And that too in relation to higher education. They said, UNESCO chair, you should have become for literacy. That's what you've done all your life, women's literacy or whatever. But higher education. So a question I have been asking myself and my fellow civil society activists and all of you, you take primary education, you take secondary education. All around the world, governance of primary education has community involvement. Parents, other stakeholders, many places, civil society is inside the governance mechanism of vocational schools, of secondary schools, of primary schools. When it comes to universities, they only have professors or bureaucrats. That's it. Some engineering colleges and some management schools, because they want to raise some money, have brought in some industry people. Where is civil society? Where is community leadership in the governance of universities? And in many countries, as higher education has been gaining greater attention and expansion is taking place, by public policy, higher education institutions are being located in hitherto unsupplied areas like indigenous people or faraway locations, and not just in metros or metropolitan centers. Look, there you are teaching the same curriculum with the same pedagogy and behaving exactly the same. Context matters nothing. History matters nothing there. Politics matters nothing. So I think bet on students, incite them, and tell all your civil society friends to demand accountability of higher education from tomorrow. We have done with demanding accountability of primary education, demanding accountability of secondary education. There is no network anywhere in the world of civil society which focuses on accountability of higher education. So all the debate on governance of higher education is carried out by the same fellows who are sitting in governance. We are happy to talk about governance of private sector, governance of multinationals. What about governance of higher education institutions? Isn't that a societal question? So, I would bet on students. I will incite them, excite them, provoke them, make them rebel wherever possible.
Not an idea, sir. We have time for one or two more. Maya, please.
I was just wondering,
Again, introduce yourselves.
hello, I'm Maya Mithan. I'm based at the School of Global Studies and I teach anthropology. I've also been working a lot with sort of NGOs and civil society organizations, and also understanding the difference between NGOs and civil society organizations. It's two very different things. But My question was really more along the lines of thinking about the mobility of people, these knowledge agents as they work, and thinking about people from civil society organizations, that and whether you could comment on this kind of pattern that you think may be, which I think is possibly emerging in India, and I don't know if it's elsewhere, of students completing their higher education, then wanting to, they see their careers within civil society organizations, and then having done that, having had that sort of community near experience, want to come and do, you know, a PhD or masters, and then go back to those organizations. And I think this is a really interesting move away from seeing this linear movement, you know, in terms of both the knowledge economy and production of knowledge. And I'm wondering if this is something you see in your experience elsewhere in the world happening, or?
Great, thank you. And in the back there.
Hi, I'm Gino Fox. I'm a research fellow here. I started a week and a half ago. I've been 30 years in industry, so this is really refreshing. I'm a bit confused. I've made a move to the dark side from industry to academia, and I'm finding it all a bit difficult. I think you answered quite a lot in your first statement, but I like your reflections really. I find that in industry, where I worked in participation, community development, and empowerment, it becomes a bit of an art rather than a science. And here I try and calibrate everything, turn it into research and papers. I'm being asked to turn things into a science. And I find it really, really difficult to make this move. I love it, it's interesting, but the work that I'm involved in is a particular project around climate change and decision making. And I'm asked to follow certain frameworks that kind of stifle my creativity, let's say. So that's about it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rajesh. So a couple of other questions here, and then Rajesh, we'll wind up after this, and I want you to just, in your last comments, maybe to reflect on one more question. You've been at this for some 40 years, and talking about the importance of people's knowledge and how people's knowledge moves from voice to power. Have we made any progress? Evelina says she wanted to hear something optimistic tonight. So have we made any progress?
Yeah. Well, your point, Maya, I think two phenomena that are happening, which were not happening at the time, you know, in the 70s or 80s. The first is that in a peculiar way, the domain of civil society has become much more public knowledge. So when you are growing up and you are thinking of what to do in life, it is something that is public knowledge. Young people who are entering, more and more young people are entering higher education, therefore are also interested in being useful to society in some way. And therefore they find working with a civil society organization as a platform to being useful. 5-6 years ago, we began to witness a phenomenon that all those students who wanted to go for an MBA, including some nephews and nieces of my own, they began to come and look up at Uncle Rajesh because they wanted an internship in PRIA, which will give them some scoring points for entrance into an MBA program. A flip side of that was that institutes of management in India, as well as international Kellogg Institute of Management, you know, every year they bring a batch to India, and just as you visit Mahatma Gandhi's shrine and building of Parliament and India Gate, you visit PRIA also. For 2 hours you pay your homage to PRIA. I've been to PRIA. So we are part of the tourist circuit now, which is fair enough. No harm if you can engage with them. But this is happening. This was not the case 5-6 years ago. So engineering students, economists, management students, architects, all this is part of that. Learning from the real world. But the other question that you posed is a bit more problematic. Every year we get 1 or 2 ideas graduates who want to come and work with PRIA. And every year we are disappointed. We disappoint them and we are disappointed because the salary we offer as an Indian civil society organization does not pay for the loan installment that they have to repay because they have studied at IDS. Okay, and that's the material reality. So yes, you can work with Oxfam or you can work with somebody else, but in most places you find it hard to work with civil society organizations if the cost of building your career has been high. And that's every year. Even this year we have said no to one IDS graduate who graduated last year, not this year. And because we offer starting salary of 30,000 rupees. Fellow said, that's the monthly installment I have to pay to repay my 8 lakh rupees of loan, or 10 lakh rupees of loan. And we understand. So we advised him where to join. CSR projects of the private companies will give you 50,000, 60,000. So, but that's a material reality which we have to confront. I don't know how widespread it is in many other countries, but independent funding of civil society organizations is at risk, and therefore, and worldwide, it is not just in India. So that's it. You are a hero to take that plunge. What else can I say except to wish you all the best? But you are dealing with different knowledge cultures. And this is what we found when we were doing the study, that knowledge culture in a university or academic institution is different from the knowledge culture in civil society. And I think you are adding the perspective of industry or private sector. There is a knowledge culture. It's not that no industry will be successful if it did not have some knowledge about its own industry, its own competition, its own products, its own regulation, its own financing, everything. Market knowledge, all that is required. But the knowledge culture is different. You put your company expansion, market capture, profit in the front in order to design knowledge research. Just as civil society would do by putting social change and social transformation, improvement in the lives of people in the front in order to draw research questions. And I think in the academic culture you put the framework or the theory or the discipline. Universities are discipline bound, and you put that there, and then you design your research question. So I think knowledge cultures are very different, which is what you are experiencing, but I'm sure you will succeed. John, your question is very difficult to answer. But one of the reasons I told you about my history, and I have reflected on it myself several times, is I'm surprised at my amount of investment I'm making in dealing with higher education today. I'm surprised myself. And the reason I think there is hope for the change that we are seeing is I think today there is greater readiness in even some very traditional programs, departments or universities to ask this question about relevance of their teaching, relevance of their knowledge. Not necessarily only in the neighborhood sense, relevance to my neighborhood, but in the larger sense of, social context, humanity question, etc., etc. And I think this is coming not just from policymakers or funders, but it is also coming from faculty, from academics themselves, and from students. And so I think this opens up the possibility that the institutions which produce next generation of knowledge producers which certify next generation of knowledge producers, will themselves begin to be more open, more multipolar, multimodal, multiform, and that is, I think, a good thing. And when I ask this question myself, that why am I spending so much of my time and energy dealing with higher education, that's where I see that. And I see that happening in many parts of the world. And I think this is, therefore, the question of people's knowledge gaining certain degree of legitimacy, not just in the field of social action, but also in knowledge industry, knowledge production. I think it's because if the producers of knowledge, future generation of producers of knowledge, all of you young people who are getting MAs and PhDs from University of Sussex and IDS, if you go out being clear in your head that there are multiple modes of knowledge production, multiple forms of knowledge, then you will seek ways to bring that knowledge as part of your knowledge work. And that's what we are hoping, and that's why we are engaging with higher education institutions. So time seems to be right, because higher education cannot solve all the problems of the world, but it needs to become more engaged. Public discourse, public space, public intellectuals, public conversation, these are all functions which, when I was a student, used to be performed on campuses. We didn't have media, we didn't have social media, we didn't have... So, where did we debate issues? On campuses, in classrooms, with visiting scholars, with speakers. We used to have artists come and give a talk on powerlessness or whatever. So, it was that space, public space for multiple perspectives being talked about, multiple forms of knowledge being respected. I think that is what I see as potential in higher education institutions, and that's where I think, therefore, the future generations of certified researchers, if they can be infected adequately, or virus can catch them properly, then I think I can call it somewhat progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Rajesh, for those reflections. Thanks to all of you for coming. We're fortunate that Rajesh is a member of the IDS Board of Trustees. We're meeting for the next couple of days. So we do at least have one very strong voice of this perspective in our own governance systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. And may I present